Right, so you ready to dive deep? Today we're taking a look at chapter 3 of the Quran, but we're not just looking at the text itself. Oh
You
no,
never do we?
never. We're going all the way back, comparing it to how Ibn Abbas interpreted it,
Decades later, no less.
like 45 years after it was supposedly revealed. So much happened in 45 years, right? Like,
Yeah.
how much did things change? How much did he clarify things? Or maybe even contradict the original text?
It's like looking at a rough sketch and then seeing a fully developed painting. You know what I mean? You got those original verses right there in the moment, and then Ibn Abbas comes along and adds all these layers of understanding. But he's bringing in his own life experiences and everything that was going on in the Islamic world at that time.
Exactly. So before we get into Ibn Abbas's take, let's set the scene a bit, right?
Yeah.
So chapter 3. And side note, it's officially number 73, but it's thought to be the third one chronologically. So this one's pretty intense, right?
Oh, absolutely. It just throws you right in, starting with this image of someone wrapped up in their cloak, probably at night, and then bam, command to pray. And not like a gentle suggestion either. It's shackles, blazing fire, day of judgment, the whole shebang.
Yeah, not exactly bedtime reading, is it?
Yeah.
Seems like a pretty heavy message about divine power and the consequences if you don't follow the rules.
It definitely is. And the language is so strong, too, really hammering in how important prayer is and how bad it is if you ignore it. There's that bit about reciting the Quran, too, but, this is early days, right? How much of the Quran even existed at this point, it makes you think.
Ooh, good point. Something to keep in mind when we look at Ibn Abbas, because I'm pretty sure he gets pretty specific about how much Quran you're supposed to be reading.
You remember correctly. He definitely adds some juicy details there. But before we jump ahead, and gotta remember the core of chapter 3, like in its original form, it's just this raw, almost desperate call to prayer. You don't see any of those specific practices or rituals that come up later on in Islam.
Right, so we got this intense, almost primal call to prayer in those original verses of chapter 3. Now, let's fast forward 45 years later, enter Ibn Abbas.
Big name, huge influence.
Definitely a major figure in early Islam, known for his tafsir, which for anyone who doesn't know, it's basically like a super detailed commentary and interpretation of the Quran.
Like adding footnotes and explanations.
Yeah, that'll be.
Trying to make it easier to understand, but also can't help but put your own spin on things.
And it's not like Ibn Abbas was just some random guy with opinions. He was family, right?
Cousin of the Prophet Muhammad himself,
Yeah.
and super connected to that early Muslim community. He had clout, for sure.
So his family connection definitely gave him some authority. And his tafsir, I mean, it became a huge deal in shaping how people understood the Quran.
Mm.
But as we go through his take on chapter 3, got to stay critical, Rand.
Always. We're not here to just take his word for it. We're comparing, contrasting, questioning, maybe even finding some contradictions. It's all part of the fun.
Absolutely. So where does Ibn Abbas even start with this whole chapter 3 thing?
Well, right off the bat, he makes this bold statement about the first verse. O you who wraps himself, he's convinced that's talking directly to the Prophet Muhammad.
Interesting, because the text itself doesn't say who it's talking to, does it? But Ibn Abbas, he's like, nope, it's the prophet, even describes him wrapping himself up in his garment for prayer.
Yeah, he goes all in. And that's when things start to get interesting, right? You have the original verse open to interpretation, and then Ibn Abbas comes along and connects it specifically to the prophet. You gotta wonder, why? What's the point of interpreting it that way?
It's not just a random detail. It changes how you understand the whole chapter. If it's just for the prophet, those warnings about punishment and all that, it hits differently.
Right. It becomes less of a universal message like, hey, everyone better pray, and more like a private message for this chosen individual. And you can't help but wonder if he's doing that on purpose to make the prophet seem even more important, more authoritative.
Yeah, like he's adding this layer of exclusivity that wasn't really there in the original. It goes from this general you to specifically the prophet, which could be interpreted as putting him in a unique position, closer to Allah.
Exactly. And that's something we got to keep in mind as we go deeper. Because Ibn Abbas doesn't stop there. He's got more to say, like how we should understand the chapter in terms of what Muslims are actually supposed to do, the rituals and all that.
Like what? Give me some examples. What does Ibn Abbas add that wasn't there before?
Well, first off, he suggests reciting at least 100 verses of the Quran every night. But remember what we said about this being an early chapter? Think about it. Did they even have 100 verses at this point?
Good point.
Yeah.
I mean, the first 3 chapters together aren't even close to 100 verses. It's like he's taking later practices and trying to make them fit with this early revelation.
Like looking back at an old photo and saying they should have been wearing those fancy watches, the ones we have now. Doesn't quite fit, does it?
Not really. And he does something similar with prayer, right? Chapter 3 doesn't talk about specific prayer times or anything like that. But Ibn Abbas, he links that whole established worship bit to the 5 daily prayers, the ones that became a core part of Islam later on. So he's taking this general idea of prayer and making it super specific, connecting it to rituals that might not have even existed back then.
Seems that way. I mean, maybe the idea of 5 daily prayers was already floating around, but it's definitely not spelled out in this chapter.
Yeah.
Ibn Abbas, he's adding details and structure that weren't there in the original.
So we got Ibn Abbas narrowing things down to the prophet, adding in specific practices, and it's starting to feel like we're dealing with 2 different versions of chapter 3 here.
And it gets even wilder when he starts bringing in these outside stories, like full-on narratives.
Whoa, really? So chapter 3, it briefly mentions the story of Moses and Pharaoh, right? What does Ibn Abbas do with that?
He takes that little mention and runs with it. The chapter just says, hey, a messenger was sent to Pharaoh, just like one was sent to the people of Mecca. But Ibn Abbas, he goes off on a tangent about Pharaoh rebelling against Moses, all the punishments, even the whole dramatic drowning in the sea.
It's like he's assuming everyone already knows those stories, and he's just reminding them. But if you're coming at this fresh, without that background, it feels like he's just making stuff up, right?
Right. It really shows how an interpreter's own background, all that cultural and religious stuff, can totally change how they understand and present a text. And that whole tendency to embellish, to add details that aren't actually there, it gets even more obvious when you see how he handles a story that's not even mentioned in chapter 3. Adam.
Adam. Where does he even get that from? Chapter 3 doesn't say anything about Adam.
He takes this verse about the day of judgment, the one where children will turn gray, and somehow uses that to bring in this whole story about Allah commanding Adam to send a bunch of his descendants to hell.
Wow, that is dark. But definitely not in chapter 3. It's like he's pulling in a totally different story, a whole different set of beliefs to make a point that wasn't even being made in the first place.
Exactly. Makes you wonder, what's he trying to do here? Is he just adding context, or is he forcing a later interpretation onto this early text?
Is he illuminating the text, or is he, like, hijacking it? It seems like he's building a bigger, more elaborate narrative, but is it a legitimate interpretation? That's the big question.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to think critically, question those assumptions, and consider all those historical and cultural factors that could be shaping things. It's a lot more complex than just reading the words on the page.
Well said. So we started with this intense call to prayer, and now we're dealing with interpretations, added stories, and a whole focus on the prophet. It's clear that Ibn Abbas, he adds a lot to chapter 3, but are those additions faithful to the original? I guess that's what we got to figure out.
Oh, absolutely. We're just getting started. And trust me, there's more surprises in store as we go through Ibn Abbas's commentary. Stay tuned. We're still deep in chapter 3 of the Quran, with Ibn Abbas and his whole commentary.
We're talking about how he brings in those extra stories.
Yeah.
Like the whole Adam and hell thing. I mean, is that even allowed? Are you supposed to just add stuff like that to religious texts?
Well, that's a big question, isn't it? It really depends. Like, different religions have different rules, different histories.
Yeah.
But for Islam, the Quran is supposed to be the literal word of God revealed through the Prophet Muhammad.
Right, so it's a big deal, changing the meaning or adding to it.
Huge. So the whole idea of tafsir, it gets really tricky. It's supposed to help you understand the Quran, especially those parts that are kind of vague or could mean different things.
But how do you explain what it means without changing what it means?
Yeah.
It's a fine line.
It is. And you can definitely see that tension in how Ibn Abbas handles chapter 3. Like, remember those verses that were added later, the ones that kind of soften the tone a bit about how not everyone can pray all night long?
Yeah, about patience and understanding and stuff. It definitely feels different from that initial, super intense warning about prayer.
Totally. So it's fascinating to see how Ibn Abbas deals with these verses. Does he say, hey, these were added later, or does he try to make them fit with his whole idea that the chapter is just for the prophet?
Knowing him, I bet he tries to make it fit his narrative somehow.
Well, you're not wrong. He doesn't actually say anything about them being added later, but he definitely interprets them in a way that focuses on the prophet's own experiences.
Like how?
So verse 10 says, and bear with patience what they utter, and part from them with a fair leave-taking. Seems pretty straightforward, right? Like general life advice.
Yeah, just dealing with difficult people.
Right. But Ibn Abbas, he takes that and makes it super specific. Like it's advice for the Prophet Muhammad on how to deal with people in Mecca who were rejecting him and being mean to him.
So he takes this general advice and turns it into a specific historical event. Almost like he's using those verses to prove that the prophet was chosen by God and had to face opposition.
It's definitely open to that interpretation. And he does the same thing with verse 11, the one that says, "Leave me to deal with the deniers, lords of ease and comfort, and do thou respite them a while." Ibn Abbas reads that as God literally telling the prophet, hey, let me deal with these people who don't believe. You just sit back and wait for their punishment.
It's interesting how he frames it as the prophet's personal struggle, even though the text itself doesn't really say that.
Right, subtle but important. It makes you think, does this make the verses less relevant for regular people?
That's a good question. If it's just about historical figures, does it still have the same impact?
Exactly. And that's where interpretation gets really tricky. It's about connecting the dots between the text and your own life. But how much can you change before it's not the same text anymore?
So true. But speaking of connecting the dots, isn't there another part where Ibn Abbas kind of goes off the rails with his interpretation?
There is. Remember that verse about the goodly loan? It seems pretty simple, but Ibn Abbas really goes all out explaining it.
Seems pretty clear, right?
Yeah, like giving to charity, doing good deeds.
Right. But Ibn Abbas takes it even further. Like, it's not just giving money, it's any good deed you do. And those good deeds, they're like investments, stored with Allah, and then you get even bigger rewards in the afterlife.
Wow. Okay. That's a powerful image. For sure. It plays into that whole human desire for fairness. Like, if I do good, I deserve good, even in the afterlife. But the question is that really what the original verse was getting at?
Yeah, maybe it just meant helping those in need without all the extra stuff about rewards in heaven.
Exactly. And that's where it gets blurry, right? Is Ibn Abbas interpreting or is he embellishing? Adding meaning that wasn't there before or just unpacking what was already implied?
It's hard to say for sure, which is why it's so important to think critically, be skeptical, and not just take everything at face value, especially when it comes to interpretations.
Right. You got to ask yourself, is this person actually explaining the text or are they just putting their own ideas onto it? But there's one more part we got to talk about, something Ibn Abbas says that really gets to the heart of how he sees the relationship between the Prophet Muhammad and Allah.
Ooh, sounds intense.
Huh.
We've already seen how he makes the prophet seem more important, interpreting everything through the lens of his experiences. What else did he do?
Remember that last bit in his explanation of the goodly loan verse about the mercy of he who is enveloped in his cloak?
Yeah, that was a weird one. Especially since he said the whole chapter is about the prophet.
It's definitely a loaded statement. Makes you think about divine mercy and what the prophet's role is in all of this.
Okay, you got to tell me more. What does he say about the cloak? And what does it have to do with the prophet?
Well, yeah, it's definitely one of those moments where you really see his perspective coming through. That statement about the mercy of he who is enveloped in his cloak at the end of that goodly loan verse, it's pretty intense.
Just to recap, what was the context for that again?
So he's talking about how those good deeds, they're like investments stored with Allah, right? And then he ends by saying, those who do good, they'll get forgiveness and a noble reward because of the mercy of he who is enveloped in his cloak.
And here he said he thinks the whole chapter is talking to the prophet. So that cloak statement, it kind of hits different, doesn't it?
It does. It almost makes it sound like Allah's mercy, it depends on the prophet. Like, it goes through him to get to everyone else.
Well, hold on. That's a lot. Is that even in the verse?
Not really. The verse just talks about Allah multiplying rewards for those who do good. The prophet and the cloak, that's all Ibn Abbas.
It's almost like he's putting the prophet in the middle. Like you need him to get to Allah's mercy.
Yeah, that's one way to read it. And it makes you think, what did Ibn Abbas really think about the prophet's role? Was he just a messenger or was he something more?
Yeah, I mean, maybe he's just trying to say the prophet is important, a role model. Yeah. But it does feel like he's going beyond what the text actually says.
It does, and it shows how interpretations, they can get kind of distorted, especially when they're influenced by ideas that came later. It's a reminder to always be careful, not just take things at face value.
So what's the takeaway for us? Trying to understand this ancient text and all these different interpretations, it's a lot.
It's about reading with an open mind, but also a critical eye. You got to question things, consider the historical context, all that. Don't just assume any interpretation is the right one.
Right, like Ibn Abbas, he was a respected scholar, but he still had his own biases, his own way of seeing things.
Exactly. His interpretation can be helpful, but it's not the final word. Everyone has to engage with the text, think for themselves, and come to their own conclusions.
Well said. So we went from a chapter about prayer to like a whole philosophical debate, historical analysis, and even a mystery cloak. That escalated quickly.
Yeah, we covered a lot of ground, looked at things from different angles, and hopefully got people thinking.
That's the goal. And hey, we might never know what Chapter 3 was really supposed to mean, or if the B'nai Boss got it right, but it's the journey, the exploration, that's what matters.
Couldn't agree more. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into Chapter 3 of the Quran and Ibn Abbas's commentary.
Thanks for joining us.
If you enjoyed this, be sure to check out our other episodes. We talk about all sorts of interesting stuff.
And remember, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep the conversation going. See you next time.